Support for this episode of the Energy 3 comes from Miss Shager's Period 7 Contemporary World class. Hi, my name's Zach Howard.
I'm Matt Bomer.
And I'm Griffin Lundquist, and this is the Energy 3, the show where we discuss the most relevant environmental topics and news.
The topic we're going to discuss today is clean energy. Now, what even is clean energy?
Well, in short, clean energy is also called renewable energy because it comes from a source that can't be depleted and doesn't release any carbon into the atmosphere. But these sources can range from the sun to wind to even the heat underground. But the point is, scientists have been creating new technologies that are harnessing these constant sources of energy. A simple example would be a wind turbine that uses the wind to spin its blades that powers a generator. A more complex example would be a solar cell, which are made up of sheets of semiconductive silicon that release electrons when photons from the sun hit them. And since the wind is always blowing and the sun shines when we need electricity most, we would never run out.
Well, I like the idea, but what's wrong with fossil fuels? I mean, their discovery is what sparked the Industrial Revolution and have more or less constructed the modern lifestyle we live and have today. So why would renewables be any better?
I'll let Ms. Jaconet take this one.
In your opinion, is it important to switch from fossil fuels to clean energy? If so, why?
Yes, I think it's important. I think at some point we're going to need to make that shift. Fossil fuels have been very important in terms of getting our society to where it is today in terms of our growth and development, but the two downsides to fossil fuels is, of course, their contribution to climate change and then also the fact that they're a non-renewable resource. So, no one can really predict exactly when they'll run out, but to build your whole sort of modern day system on a resource that will eventually run out, it seems like a short-term view. So at some point we're going to need to shift to some more long-term renewable options.
Yep.
The other side of it, though, of course, is, as I said, the evidence really seems to suggest that increases in CO2 are warming the planet. It's hard to say how extreme the consequences of that increase will be, but I think the link between the amount we're burning fossil fuels and the rise in CO2 are pretty clear. So for those two reasons, I think a shift is not only necessary, but I think it's sort of imminent. It's going to have to happen at some point.
Yep.
That was Michael Aikenhead, the AP Environmental Science teacher at Staples High School. This is actually a really interesting situation because fossil fuels are so vital for most businesses to sustain their practice. But the problem is that we are building this empire using energy that we can't get back, and the end result will end up being a forced shift to renewable energy instead of a more gradual transition.
So obviously, we'll be seeing an inevitable switch to renewables in the coming decades, but this all depends on individual countries' efforts, right? I mean, I'm sure some countries are in different places than others.
Well, you're right, but different factors go into being able to say that whether or not you are a country that has made a significant effort to use renewables. For example, countries like China and the US have the most industry in the world, but use less than 10% of the energy through renewable energy, while countries like Costa Rica have been 100% renewable for over a year, but have no industry whatsoever. It's hard to justify whether a country is or should be making a better effort to shift to renewables. If you look at how important some countries are to the rest of the world in terms of exported goods, do any of you guys know any countries that have been stepping it up lately?
Actually, I heard that the UK has recently made some big steps toward renewables.
Really?
Yeah, I heard they spent a whole 24 hours without the use of coal-fired power plants. First time since the 1880s. A company based in London also sealed a deal to purchase a 1.8 gigawatt portfolio of the US solar projects.
That's actually pretty cool. But what we need to see a change in sooner rather than later is the electric grid. Right now, we live in a world where we have large power plants supplying electricity to large populations of people. But according to Mr. Aikenhead, this is exactly what we have to move away from. When it says that the world will be soon moving toward a place with more decentralized micro power plants, how is this different from what we see now and how will it help?
Okay, so right now, most of our energy is generated in a small number of large power plants. And then, for example, I forget the exact percentage, but a large percentage, maybe 30% of all the electricity in Connecticut comes from one nuclear power plant. Now, that poses real risks from sort of a national security standpoint. If something were to ever happen to one of those plants, that would mean the whole system will basically feel the repercussions. Beyond that, the fact that most of our plants, though, are fossil fuel based, whether that's natural gas, coal, or oil, means we're all getting our electrons, our electricity, from some fossil fuel source. If, however, you can create microgrids, which basically means, let's say you take something the size of a large neighborhood, and that neighborhood is now on its own grid system where the electricity is distributed, and that one neighborhood figures out a way that they will produce their electricity. Now, it's possible they could put in a small generator power plant that's based on fossil fuels, but that same community might build a solar array or a fuel cell or some other type of renewable option to create the energy that would then supply that small community or microgrid. So that would allow us to transition more gradually and implement a little bit at a time more renewable options. Like I said, it would be impossible overnight to build solar panels to replace all the energy coming from fossil fuels. But a neighborhood here, one at a time, could start to supply the energy from renewables and then wean ourselves off those big plants so that when we finally reach that threshold where enough is supplied from renewable, you can turn those other power plants off. So it's instead of a shock to the system, it's a gradual implementation. But again, I think from more the standpoint of like a stability and national security standpoint, microgrids, spread out the risk. If one microgrid goes down, the whole nation doesn't go down, the whole state doesn't go down. Just one little community might be affected, but if someone really wants to mess with our society, our way of life, attack the grid, attack the electric grid, and we'd all basically be in a lot of trouble.
The extreme solution to energy use is to eventually have our global CO2 production to be at net zero. However, this is highly unlikely to happen in the near future because countries like the US and China still run their industries using fossil fuels that are still relatively cheap.
What is holding countries back from completely getting rid of fossil fuel power plants today and using clean energy?
It would be impossible to just switch overnight. I mean, when people really start to look at how much of our energy comes from fossil fuel-based energy resources, we don't have enough renewables today to just make that switch. It's going to have to be a targeted, gradual, but at the same time, we need to get moving. Like, we need to really make a commitment towards making that shift. But the fact of the matter is, it's economics. Right now, fossil fuels are still relatively cheap, and as long as it's cheap to use them, it's easy to ignore sort of those external costs of impact to the environment and pollution and those sorts of things. But as long as the dollars and cents of it is still cheap, it's very easy to choose that option. I mean, most people's interests and commitments fall with job growth, economic growth, and the basis of that is often a cheap energy source. So as long as fossil fuels are cheap, it's going to be difficult to make that immediate switch.
That concludes this episode of The Energy 3. Special thanks to Mr. Aikenhead for the interview.
Tune in next week where we talk about more environmental topics.
The Energy 3 is signing off.
Bye.